science policy. Next, Dr. Karen Kehl is a health scientist administrator in the Office of End-of-Life and Palliative Care Research, NINR centers overseeing a portfolio focused on end-of-life care and hospice and NINR Research Centers Program Awards. Dr. Kehl's research background focuses on improving preparation of families for care in the last phase of life in the home hospice setting. Previously, she was an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing and the clinical director of a regional hospice. Dr. Kehl is a fellow in palliative care nursing and holds BS, MS, and PhD degrees in nursing. Last but not least, Dr. Jerry Miller is a member of the National Institute for Nursing Research and has been a member since 2008, where she holds several programmatic and administrative roles within the Division of Extramural Sciences programs. She serves as the chief of the Office of End-of-Life and Palliative Care Research, whose mandate is to expand the national impact of end-of-life and palliative care science. She also oversees the NINR Research Centers programs and has served as a senior health science policy analyst within the Division of Science, Policy, and Public Liaison. She's also the project scientist on several trans-NIH healthcare systems, collaboratory, pragmatic clinical trials that also involve palliative care. Dr. Miller is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Roundtable on Quality of Care for People with Serious Illness, a staunch advocate for palliative care and palliative care science at all levels. Her favorite efforts are in building the NINR-supported Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group as a resource for research, training, mentoring, and supporting the critical work of palliative care scientists at all levels of career development. And this particular webinar is an indication of all of our colleagues, Dr. Kehl, Adams, and Miller's tremendous commitment to PCRC. We're very grateful for you and for your deep commitment to our investigators' development. So we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ritchie, Christine. This is Jerry Miller, and I want to extend a real warm greetings to everyone attending this webinar. We hope that you're safe and you're well in these extraordinary times. And we want to thank you for all that you do in palliative care. We're really, really pleased that you've joined us today in the second of our NIH program chats. I guess we'll have to call this virtual chats with program officers. We really had an enormous amount of good feedback from the PCRC membership on our first webinar. And we've been really enthused to now continue this effort with the PCRC. Today, Lynn and Karen have put together what I think is a really terrific presentation on issues around clinical trials at NIH, from understanding the when and the how and the why of data and safety monitoring plans, the NIH clinical trial dissemination plan, what is that? And use of the single IRB around NIH policy. Karen and Lynn have created this presentation to be highly interactive. And so we hope that you'll have opportunities and you will take advantage of opportunities to ask questions, and or you can email us later. We're here to help you. So without further ado, may I present Lynn and Karen, who will be discussing our webinar today.
Great. Thank you, Jerry, Dr. Miller, sorry. And thank you to PCRC for having us today. We're so excited to be here yet again. And so I'm going to go briefly, if you want to go to the next slide. This may look familiar to some of you, but NIH has a fairly broad definition of what a clinical trial is. It's considered a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, and this may include placebo or other type of control, and with the goal of evaluating the effects of an intervention on health-related biomedical and biobehavioral outcomes. And the breadth of this definition is intentionally broad, given the nature of the NIH portfolio and the need for maximal transparency. And NIH's concerns about transparency stem in part from issues that surround reporting of clinical trials data, because for both NIH-funded and non-NIH-funded trials, unreported data and untimely dissemination of results has been documented over and over again. So clinical trials, as you can see from this image, may be of a variety of types: mechanistic, exploratory or developmental, pilot or feasibility studies, or any other type of interventional studies. And then we have this behavioral and what NIH considers basic experimental studies involving humans, and we call BESH because we just love our acronyms. And so the key question to ask when determining if a clinical trial is BESH is whether or not the study aims to understand fundamental aspects of a phenomena or observable facts without a specific application toward processes or products in mind. So if the translational nature of a study is only aspirational or alluded to in the purpose or the public health implications, for example, the findings may have potential applications in the future, then the study is not truly applied and is not said to have a process or a product in mind. However, studies that will be examining mechanisms through which an intervention may work or the processes that account for an intervention's effects on a clinical outcome, that would be considered to have a process or product in mind and therefore would not be considered BESH. And these should be submitted under a clinical trial required FOA. Okay, and we can go to the next slide. You're ahead of me. So these 4 questions are the primary guide to determine whether or not your study is a clinical trial. And if the answers to the 4 questions are yes, then your study does meet the NIH definition of a clinical trial. Even if you're studying healthy participants, your study does not have a comparison group, is only designed to assess pharmacokinetics, safety, or maximum tolerated doses of an investigational drug. If your study's utilizing behavioral intervention, studies intended solely to refine measures are not considered clinical trials, however, and studies that involve secondary research with biological specimens or health information are also not considered clinical trials. And the next slide. And we're going to stop there. Oh, no, we're not, sorry. So who decides if this is a clinical trial? So you can discuss this with your program officer. Ultimately, the Division of Receipt and Referral will make a determination when they receive your application. So you want to make sure that you are sure that you're applying to the right FOA. And NIH does have clinical trial allowed, clinical trial not allowed, clinical trial optional. So you want to make sure that you are submitting to the proper FOA. That's what I wanted to say. Prior to questions. So if anyone has any questions, I believe we can put those in the chat and Karen and I can answer.
So Lynn, I have a question. What happens if your program officer says that this is a clinical trial and you don't think it is?
Well, so we try not to make those determinations for you, but we will help to guide you in this decision. You can go to the Office of Extramural Research prior to submission just to make sure you're submitting to the correct FOA, because they will help you determine, as they are the ones that, as I said, will be doing the final determination.
Naomi, do you have other questions for us?
I see one question that's come in, and that is how to define the prospectively assignments.
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, prospective assignment is always a bit of a challenge. So if the determination, if you are deciding in advance whether someone does or does not get an intervention, that would be prospective assignment. So if you have a study where everybody is getting the intervention, it still can be prospective assignment if that is determined because they are in the study. It's a different situation if you are only accepting patients, we'll say, who are getting chemotherapy, but the chemotherapy isn't assigned because of the study. That would then be a study criteria, not prospective assignment. Prospective assignment can be a tricky one, and I'll say that if you go on the NIH webpage on clinical trials. If you have a hard time finding it, contact your program officer. They can help you get to the page. But there's actually a great page of a few clinical examples of what is and isn't a clinical trial, and a number of frequently asked questions to help you decide whether or not your study has prospective assignment and is a clinical trial.
We have another question. If it's a pilot study to assess only feasibility and acceptability of the intervention, is it considered as a clinical trial?
So if the study is not determining the health outcomes from an intervention, then it would not be considered a clinical trial. However, you have to be careful. So if you are measuring any health outcomes, and that can be physical, psychological, that kind of thing, and measuring those outcomes, then it would be considered a clinical trial. So I think for any particular individual study, it's best to talk to a program officer about your study design to determine whether or not it would indeed be considered a clinical trial.
Thank you. I think we answered all of the questions so far.
Then we will move on to the next topic, and you'll notice that we do stop frequently, so please don't feel like you have to wait till the end to ask questions. If something comes up, go ahead and put it in the box. Next, we'd like to talk a little bit about what is different for clinical trials. And there are a few things that clinical trials must have in the application that are not necessarily in other applications. One of these is a data safety monitoring plan, which we'll talk about for a bit. Another is a dissemination plan. And the third is a clinical trial protocol. And I will mention that just briefly now. Clinical trial protocols, what is required varies some from one institute to another. So we aren't going to talk about that today because there is such variation that it is best if you contact the program officer for the institute or center that you're planning on applying for and finding out what they want for a clinical trial protocol and when they want it. Sometimes it's with the application, sometimes it's later in the just-in-time process. Also, if your study is multi-site, it will require a single IRB plan. And we'll talk about that a bit today as well. So let's start with DSMPs, DSMCs, DSMBs, and so on. All clinical trials that are funded by NIH require a data and safety monitoring plan, which is a DSMP. So everybody should have a DSMP for their clinical trial. For phase 3 NIH clinical trials and some phase 1 and 2 that are greater than minimal risk, they may require a data and safety monitoring board, which is a DSMB. There are other monitoring entities as well. These include data safety committees, which may be DSC or DSMC, a safety monitoring committee, an SMC, or an independent safety monitor. The reason we talk about all these different ones is because in different institutes and centers, there are somewhat different requirements. As you can see, there are links for almost every institute or center that has their own specific policy about data and safety monitoring. So we aren't going to go into great detail here because it depends on what you're applying to and what institute. But there are some universals that are true for all of them. All data and safety monitoring plans have to identify who their monitoring entity is. So are you using a data safety monitoring board? If you're using a board, where is that board coming from? Is it at your institution? Is it from the institute or center? Is it some other external DSMB? Are you using an independent monitor? You need to identify who that is and what the procedures are for monitoring that study safety, how often you're going to check on things, what things you're going to check. The next section is one that we particularly wanted to talk to you about today because it's becoming more and more important as we have more and more data from multiple sources that are coming in electronically. The data and safety monitoring plan should have a plan and procedure for monitoring the data safety, including data quality, management of the data, confidentiality, and security. So that's a section that we find that people often don't realize they need to include in a data safety monitoring plan. There should also be procedures for identifying, reviewing, and reporting adverse events and unanticipated problems, and procedures to ensure compliance with your data safety monitoring plan across sites if you have a multi-site study. Most data safety monitoring plans also ask for assessment of external factors that may impact the safety of participants or the ethics for the study. For example, if you find out partway through that there is a difference in treatment that is, one is potentially harmful, you certainly would want to have a plan for how you were going to monitor what was going on with other studies that are looking at those kind of things as you could. If you're planning an interim or futility analysis, that information should also be in your data safety monitoring plan. And the data safety monitoring plan needs to be complete and approved by your institute or center. So we'll take a pause here again and see if we have questions on data and safety monitoring plans. I'm going to start with one that I have heard quite a bit lately. If you're putting in an application and it might go to a couple of different institutes, we'll say that you're going to put NINR as primary and NCI as secondary, there are different policies for data and safety monitoring plans. Which format should you follow? This is a great question because the truth is you do the best you can to follow the policy of the institute that you are primarily targeting. If your application is assigned to a different institute, the data safety monitoring plan is not scored in review. They note whether it is sufficient or not, but it is not a score driving factor. So you do have the opportunity in the just-in-time period, if a just-in-time response is requested, you can amend or change your data safety monitoring plan to meet that of the institute. Do we have other questions about data safety monitoring plans?
Yes, DSMB should be an independent entity, or can it be part of a research team?
That's a great question. So data and safety monitoring boards have specific standards for what degree of independence they must have from the study, as well as sometimes from the institution. And it's important that you follow the policy for the particular institute that you're aiming towards, because there are some differences there. Occasionally, you will see a funding opportunity announcement that may require an external data safety monitoring board, excuse me, and then you would need to use that external board. Other times it can be within your institution, but the data and safety monitoring should have some degree of independence from the study team, unless it is a minimal risk study where you have an investigator who is serving as their own monitor. And some institutes allow that and others do not.
Thank you. And what is the policy regarding DSMP for non-NIH funded trials?
As we look at one another, that's a great question. And I would say you need to talk to your funder as well as your institution. Some institutions require data safety monitoring boards for certain types of trials, regardless of who funds it. Others do not. So you always have to go by your institutional guidelines and regulations. But you would need to contact the funder and find out their take on it. that actually brings up another question that I had asked of me recently. And that's if your institution does require a data safety monitoring board, but your program officer says based on the degree of risk of your study, you would be fine with a safety monitoring committee, what do you do? You always have to follow essentially the most restrictive. So if your institution says that you have to have a data safety monitoring board, then you need to have a data safety monitoring board.
Thank you, that's great advice. And can you talk about DSMP in lower risk research, such as psychosocial research? What are the requirements there?
So there still needs to be a data and safety monitoring plan. And the plan still needs to include those same elements. You still need to identify who's going to monitor, what they're going to monitor, what are adverse events and unanticipated problems, what are you going to do about them. So all of those elements still need to be there. What's going to be different is if it's lower risk, you more likely will find that it's appropriate to have an independent safety monitor or a safety monitoring committee as opposed to a data safety monitoring board. I can only speak to NINR's data safety monitoring policy, but in our policy, data safety monitoring boards have very specific requirements that are perhaps more than you want to do if it's not required. So it is important to match the level of monitoring to the degree of risk of your trials. So you're not doing more than you need to do, but you are adequately protecting your participants.
Great, and it seems that's all the questions that have come in so far.
And we shall move to the next topic.
Great. So yes, let's briefly talk about dissemination plans. So this is something that often gets confused with a publication plan or a resource sharing plan. The NIH clinical trials dissemination plan is not necessarily an outline of where you will disseminate your research through presentations or publications. It's also not a description of how you will share data and other resources. It is a plan for how you will comply with the NIH policy on the dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information. So we have a few key elements of the dissemination plan we can go through with you. If I can get to that slide, there we go. So the dissemination plan doesn't have to be long, but be sure to include enough information that you assure that we have the following information. First of all, that you will ensure that the clinical trial is registered with clinicaltrials.gov and that summary results information will be submitted to clinicaltrials.gov in the timeline stated in your dissemination policy. You don't want to restate that you will follow the policy. You want to tell us how. You want to also ensure that informed consent documents for clinical trials will include a specific statement relating to the fact that there will be posting of clinical trial information and results at clinicaltrials.gov. And you also want to state that the recipient institution has an internal policy in place to ensure that clinical trials registration and results reporting will occur in compliance with policy requirements. And that was a short topic. So, so I have a question that I often get is do all clinical trials need to have a dissemination plan, or is it only applicable clinical trials?
So actually all NIH-funded clinical trials need to have a dissemination plan, and that should be included in the application. Again, this is one of those things that if it is not there, or if it's not complete in the application, that's not a score driving factor in review, but it will need to be amended then during the just-in-time. I think the other piece that I often get asked is, well, you know, I've got a pilot study, it's a clinical trial, but do I really need a dissemination plan? And according to the NIH policy, all phases of clinical trial need dissemination plans. So even if your study is an N of 1, if it is an NIH-funded clinical trial, it does need to have a dissemination plan. Are there any other questions?
I was just gonna remind people that if you have any questions about what to put in your dissemination plan, you can contact your program officer, but there's also a lot of information on the NIH website that would outline exactly what it is that you need to put in that plan.
Thank you, that's very helpful. We don't have any questions coming in just yet. Maybe we'll wait just a few more seconds.
I think sometimes dissemination plans get a little bit confusing because we also talk about dissemination of our research in terms of publication and presentations. And then it also gets complicated when we talk about dissemination and implementation research. So we wanted to make sure that you were clear on what NIH is talking about in terms of a dissemination plan.
We have one question. If it's not a clinical trial, but does involve human subjects, do you still need a dissemination plan?
Not if it's not a clinical trial. This is for NIH-defined clinical trials.
Okay. And qualitative data should that be disseminated in trials.gov?
That's a wonderful question. So if it is a clinical trial, it needs to be registered in clinicaltrial.gov, and the results that they request need to be reported. Typically, that is more quantitative numerical data, but we would advise you to contact clinicaltrials.gov to be clear about what data they do and do not want on the clinicaltrials.gov site.
Excellent. That's all the questions that have come in so far. I'm sure that they'll keep oh, one more. I'm thinking of pilot feasibility trial that includes qualitative data. I think that was a clarification from a previous question.
So as Lynn said before, if it is only feasibility, if you are not collecting biobehavioral outcomes or health-related outcomes, you're only looking at feasibility outcomes, then it doesn't fit the NIH definition of a clinical trial and would not require a dissemination plan. If it does fit the NIH definition of a clinical trial, so if you're also collecting information on whether or not this improved their pain, then it would be considered a clinical trial and would need dissemination through clinicaltrials.gov.
Excellent. And that's all our questions so far.
Great, then we will move to the next topic.
Just single IRB or institutional review boards. We're just going to go over a few brief things that you will need to know. So there are several notices that are available that provide information on the single IRB policy, beginning with the one on the top was issued in 2016 down to the most recent additional guidance on NIH policy for single IRBs. So these are all listed here. You can also go to the NIH website for more information. And if you have any questions, of course, we can always send you the links. Next slide. So the revised common rule for single IRB applies to all research approved by an IRB on or after January 21st of 2019. So as of January 20th of 2020, the compliance date for the single IRB requirements, all cooperative research that's subject to the revised common rule is required to use a single IRB, whether the research was initially approved by a single IRB or by multiple IRBs. And yes, I have had studies in my portfolio that were initially had multiple IRBs and then they had to go to a single IRB. So that is a requirement. And so what does this mean? And again, there is a lot of information on the NIH website. We have, I think, some of the most pertinent information listed here. But essentially, if a study received initial IRB approval on or after January 20th of 2020, then it must use a single IRB. And this includes K and F awards. And again, if you have any questions, you can refer to the notice or call your program officer. One thing I want to make sure that you might want to note is that the modification to applicability for career development K and fellowship F awards has resulted in a change to Forms E application instructions for the human subjects and clinical trials information forms. These were not large changes, but things that you want to be aware of. So again, we won't go into details, but please contact us if you have any questions about that. So exceptions to single IRB policy are automatic. If there's a local IRB review required by federal or tribal or state law, regulations, or policies. However, the specific law, regulation, policy should be cited in the grant application or contract proposal single IRB plan. Exceptions will only be made for sites affected by that state law, regulation, or policy. Other sites that are not affected by it will be expected to rely on a single IRB. And one of the things that we often have questions about is foreign sites. So an exception for foreign sites is not required because a single IRB policy applies only to domestic sites. So if you have a multi-site study with a foreign site, it is not subject to the single IRB policy and therefore does not need to use a single IRB. Again, we'll say this a lot, contact your program officer if you have any questions.
So there are a lot of questions that we get about IRBs and single IRBs, and we'd like to address a few of those up front. And then while we are doing this, please feel free to put in your questions. So one of the questions that we get often is, what is the difference between a central IRB and a single IRB? Both are really designed to help streamline the IRB review, and some people do use the terms interchangeably. In general, or when NIH is discussing it, when we're talking about a central IRB, that is a single IRB of record that provides the ethical review for all of the sites, usually in more than one multi-site study. So some of the examples are a network may have a central IRB and every study conducted in that network might need to go through that central IRB. Or there may be a particular program where all of the studies have to go through a central IRB. A single IRB is one IRB of record which is selected on a study-by-study basis, which provides the ethical review for all of the sites participating in a particular multi-site study. Another thing that the NIH policy talks about is that all of the sites using the same research protocol must be under a single IRB. So there's been some question of what is meant by the same research protocol. Protocols that are addressing the same research questions, use the same methodology, and evaluate the same outcome in a study are considered to be the same research protocol. So if you have sites that are accruing that are identical, except there may be a variation because in this local context, you have to do something a little bit different than that local context. If you are still addressing the same research question, the same primary methodology, and looking at the same outcomes, it would still be considered the same research protocol. Another question we get is what the options are to comply with the NIH single IRB policy. And there are really a lot of options, and we do recommend that, as we say frequently, that you talk to your program officer for the best option. But you might find that one of the sites from your study agrees to be the primary IRB, the single IRB. And if the other sites will agree with that, that may be one option for you. Your institution may require that they be the single IRB and have other IRBs agree to that. There are independent IRBs that can be used, and you may find in some funding opportunity announcements or RFAs that there are requirements that you use a particular central IRB. For example, some of the cancer clinical trials that are funded by NCI require you to use NCI's central IRB. So there are a number of options, and if you have questions about it, this is definitely one that you should talk with your program officer and get the best guidance for your particular study.
This is very helpful. We have another question. If you're transferring a clinical trial to another academic institution and was approved by the first institution's IRB prior to January 2020, would the new institution's IRB be designated as the single IRB?
So I'm going to ask you to hold that question just a minute so that we can address it when we talk about reliance agreements, because that falls under some of what happens with a reliance agreement.
Great.
I'm going to back up just a step here and talk a little bit about the PCRC. So one of the questions that comes up is whether or not the single IRB policy applies to large cooperative groups or networks like the PCRC that are funded before the policy effective date, but that have studies like PCRC's pilot studies that will be determined or started after the effective date. This policy applies to all competing grant applications. So new applications, renewals, revisions, or resubmissions do have to have a single IRB. However, when you have a group like PCRC that has been approved, there does not necessarily need to be a single IRB for all of those pilot studies that are determined after the date. The reason I say there doesn't necessarily need to be is because you also need to talk to the institute or center, and you need to talk to your institution. Some institutions are blanket requiring single IRBs for all multi-site studies. So it is always a good idea to check with your institution, to check with the program officer, but until a competing renewal goes in or a competing application goes in, you do not necessarily have to switch to a single IRB. Now, as Lynn said, she's had some where the institutions have said, yes, you need to do this. And I think that's the other question that we run into a lot. If you have an ongoing multi-site trial that's still recruiting, do you have to have a single IRB take over? And again, the policy applies to competing grant applications. So competing grant applications, whether it's a renewal or a new application, most certainly have to have a single IRB. Existing multi-site trials, it is not mandated in this. However, you need to follow your local institution and your IRB's policies for it, which might require single IRB. Let's talk a little bit about reliance agreements, and then Naomi, if I don't come back to the question, loop me back in here. So the way that you set up your single IRB is there needs to be a reliance agreement. An IRB authorization agreement is the same thing as a reliance agreement. Different places call it different things. I'll refer to it as a reliance agreement. And this is the agreement between the sites to rely on one specific IRB for a study or a set of related studies. The reliance agreement has to lay out the responsibilities of all of the parties, how communication will occur amongst these parties. For example, if there's a regulatory review, who's going to notify whom about the outcome? How will protocol changes be handled? And who is responsible for reporting unanticipated problems or non-compliance? Because you do have to think about this for all of the different sites. The IRB reliance agreement has to be approved by the single IRB, and it must be signed by institutional officials with appropriate signing authority for each of the sites, for IRBs from each of the sites. So you have to have every participating site sign the reliance agreement, unless they are granted an exception, as Lynn talked about, because it is a foreign site or because it meets the exception criteria. But you do need to have each site sign the agreement for it to count. Now, Naomi, would you re-ask that question, please?
Sure. So if you're transferring a clinical trial to another academic institution and was approved by the first institution's IRB prior to January 2020, would the new institution's IRB be designated as the single IRB?
The answer is it depends. Because you are now conducting it from another institution, the first thing to check will be your institution's policies on who has to have the single IRB. From an NIH perspective, there needs to be a single IRB and there needs to be the reliance agreement. But Lynn, correct me if you see it differently. We don't dictate which IRB that needs to be. However, if you have a reliance agreement with that first single IRB and you are now switching to a different IRB, you would have to have those reliance agreements redrawn. At the very least, you would have to have an addition to the reliance agreement for the new site. Reliance agreements are a little bit tricky. There are some great tools from NIH. So HHS has put together a very simple reliance agreement sample, and we're only showing part of it here, but you can go onto the website and print this out and use it as a template if you like. And you can see it pretty much just asks basic information about the organization, the IRB, and then starts to get into what does this apply to? Is it all human subjects research? Is it a specific protocol? So it goes on like this. So at the end, it is very clear who is responsible for what. And it even includes sections on what happens if there's a protocol deviation in a site. How does that get reported to the single IRB, and how does that get reported to appropriate authorities and funders? That's a great place to start if you haven't done this before. Okay, are there any other questions on single IRBs that we can answer for you?
We'll wait just a few seconds for people to finish typing.
This is one of those topics that's been out there for a while, but it now is applicable to all multi-site clinical trials. So we just wanted to revisit it again. I would say we probably can open it up at this point. Just if there are any questions on any of these topics that we've discussed, we'd be happy to address those. As we're moving forward, we also want to let you know that if there are particular topics or questions that you'd like to have us address on one of these upcoming webinars, please feel free to email one of us or to contact PCRC. We really are hoping that these provide you some information that you can use.
We have attendees thanking you that this was very informative.
Well, we appreciate your time today, and glad to hear that we're hitting some things that are useful. As Lynn mentioned, if you are putting in a grant application, from here on out, the forms did change May 25th. So most applications will now be using Forms F. There are still a few FOAs that are Forms E. If you run into a question and are confused, please contact your program officer because we realize this is a very new change.
And we know how you love it when the forms change, so we look forward to hearing from you.
One attendee wants to know if maybe you'll talk more about the submission to council process in depth in a future webinar.
Yes, that is the plan. We apologize. We kind of changed topics slightly because we had been getting quite a few questions about some of the changes with the single IRB, and particularly with data and safety monitoring plans and the data component. As many studies have additional online components, they're finding that they have to fill that out. We will loop back and address that topic on a future webinar.
Great, I agree this was very timely and we very much thank you for speaking on this subject.
Well, we are happy to be here. As you can see, you're welcome to email us and we will stay around for a couple more minutes if anyone else has questions.
Okay, so while the last couple questions come in, please do send any through the Zoom Q&A feature. I do want to mention that after this webinar, I'll be sending out a Zoom evaluation through your email, and we hope that you'll take a few minutes to fill that out. And here is also where we gather other topics that you might be interested in learning more about. Upcoming in June, we have another webinar with Drs. Antonia Bennett and Julie Childer speaking, and they'll be talking about outcome measurement and pediatric palliative care intervention studies. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. We can wait a few more minutes for questions to come in. And if not, these slides will be posted online and you'll have access to both Drs. Kehl and Lynn Adams' email addresses and all of the helpful resources they provided today. Okay, well, thank you to everyone who's joined, and thank you to Drs. Kehl and Adams for speaking today. Please do go to our website and find the post-webinar recording, and please do take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation. Thank you again, everyone, and take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.